It is the Banner Baseball Show. Paul Mancano joined by Connor Newcomb of the Locked On Orioles podcast. What is this, a crossover episode, Connor?
This is an amazing crossover. This is our first crossover in this platform. And thank you so much, Paul, for having me on.
Yeah, this is the first time since I left Masson. We used to collab occasionally. We did an all Camden Yards draft several years ago where you just absolutely smoked me. You took Jonathan Scope like in the 7th round. You were just pulling out all the stops. Trey Mancini, I think, was one of your drafted players in the middle rounds. Stole my first baseman. It was your knowledge of the dark ages of Orioles baseball in the early to mid 2000s really shined through.
Yeah, some say I should go outside more,
Touch
but those
grass,
people just don't grind hard enough, I think.
as Gunnar Henderson would say, touch grass. I
Yeah.
think is yeah. No, I respect the grind, Connor. You know more about the Orioles than almost anybody, and that's because you do a daily podcast on Locked On Orioles Monday through Friday, and you fortunately did not have to podcast after all 3 of the Orioles losses in Houston. But you did have to podcast after last night, and the Orioles lost their 4th straight. We're going to touch on what went wrong, essentially, during that 4-game stretch, but not why we're panicking. We're also going to touch on Heston Kjerstad, his return to the big leagues, and also maybe look ahead to the trade deadline, try to build an ideal trade candidate for the Orioles. But first, Connor, Orioles lost their 4th straight. They are in the midst of a absolutely daunting June. Tanner Bybee last night shut them down. The bats have been perhaps the most concerning part of this 4-game losing streak because aside from a couple Jordan Westbrook homers over the weekend, they really didn't do much. Aside from that, also 11-run outburst on Friday, still losing that game 14-11. And then last night, they score only 2 runs. Cleveland has the best bullpen in all of baseball. Tanner Bybee is one of the best young pitchers in all of baseball. But the bats have been frustratingly quiet as of late. After extending their streak to 22 games with a home run, that streak ends last night, and everything just seems to be a little bit off offensively for them.
Yeah, baseball's funny because you score 17 and 11 in back-to-back games, and then it just kind of shuts off. It feels like a lot of fatigue. You talked about June right now for the Orioles. They have one off day in June, and it already passed. And I talked about this on Tuesday's episode of my show. Like, when you look around the league, you are going to be hard pressed to find not just a stretch that is harder in terms of days off. Like, there are a couple other teams that have a month where they only have one day off. But in that month, to have to deal with the Braves, the Phillies, the Yankees back to back. And you would have thought early on, okay, maybe the Astros is not terrible to deal with. Well, they've been the regular Astros basically since the start of May. They were just terrible in April. And then you're like, okay, the Guardians aren't going to be very good this year. Well, the Guardians have a better record than the Orioles coming into this series. So between no off days and this stretch, you had a feeling, Paul, that they were probably going to hit a little bit of a rut. And it came here at a time that kind of makes sense, I think, is my biggest takeaway. It makes sense that if they're going to hit a rut, it would be right now. There are a lot of factors pointing in that direction.
Yeah, this is just baseball. Like, this is the natural regression of a team that is at the end of this incredibly difficult stretch. This is them finally wearing down. We thought they were going to be, able to breeze their way through this incredibly difficult June after they went 11-5 before the off day. And now they're just hitting a natural point of being tired, I think you could say. I mean, they beat up on some of the best pitchers in the game during that stretch too. They beat up on Max Fried. They beat up on Zach Wheeler, Luis Hill. They ran out of town in the Bronx. I mean, they were dominating really good pitchers for a while. This is just what happens. And Brandon Hyde acknowledged that after the game last night. He said, we have faced a lot of really good pitchers as of late, and things just can't seem to gel offensively right now because guys are getting hot at different times. We saw Adley Rutschman had a great start to the series in Houston. Cedric Mullins was looking like his old self in Houston. Jordan Westbrook hits those 2 homers, and then those guys go quiet last night, and they can't get things done offensively. This is just what happens over the course of 162, and this is what happens when you're forced to play all of these really good teams in a short amount of time. And it reminds me kind of the mini losing streak they went on at the end of June, beginning of July in 2023, where they lost 4 in a row right at the end of June, beginning of July. They lost 6 of 7 at one point. And during that stretch, they called up Colton Cowser because they needed a little bit of fresh juice. They needed some fresh legs from the minor leagues. And he was able to give them a little bit of a jolt, only hit 115 in that minor stretch. But it's similar to what they did yesterday in calling up Heston Kjerstad, who immediately made an impact with 2 hits, that ridiculously long 13 pitch at bat. They needed a little bit of an injection of just somebody who has had an off day over the last several weeks, a little bit of youth, and I think Heston Kjerstad made a lot of sense to call up at that point.
Yeah, and you mentioned Cowser last year. Yeah, Cowser wasn't great in that stretch, but he had a couple of hits in those first couple games at Yankee Stadium, and that is when the Orioles, I think it was a 4-game series, and they won the final 2 in New York, and they kind of broke out of it. That was that weird game where Gunnar hit the cameraman with the throw, and I thought, like, oh man, this is about to get really bad. And that's the game they came back and won and kind of turned things around. And I talked about that on my show today as well. Like, it's almost the exact same point of the season. Late June, they lost 4 in a row. They lost 6 out of 7. And here's a big point for perspective right here. When the Orioles finished losing 6 out of 7 in that stretch last year, they were 6 games back of the Rays in first place. They are 2 games back of the Yankees right now, even after losing 4 games in a row. So a little perspective, they're honestly in a better spot at this point, and they're going to break out of it. They're too talented. But the Kjerstad and Cowser call-up comparisons is right on the nose, because Kjerstad was, I think he was the Orioles' best player in that game on Monday night. He had the 2 hits. I think maybe that 13 pitch at bat, like I kind of thought the ball was gone off the bat on the ball he finally put in play. I think that 13 pitch at bat might wake the Orioles up. I'm not sure if Kjerstad will be in the lineup again tonight because there's a lefty on the mound and Logan Allen for Cleveland, but it's a nice little jolt. It's not a major league debut, but maybe that's even better because it's a guy in Kjerstad who's already had 2 stints and has shaken off the rust a little bit. So maybe even though Cowser brought an early jolt, maybe Kjerstad can provide a little more consistency and a little more production over the next week or so, and maybe the O's can turn 4 in a row into 4 wins in a row. We've seen them do it before. They can certainly do it again.
Yeah, they won 8 straight shortly after losing 6 of 7 at that point last year, before and after the All-Star break. I think the All-Star break could not come soon enough for this team. But you're also seeing a theme of these guys who initially were demoted coming back up and just tearing the cover off the ball and playing like guys possessed. Because Heston Kjerstad last night rips that first pitch into right field, runs in the face of the right fielder, and earns a hustle double down the line, and just feels fired up. We saw it with Colton Cowser, after the tough stretch last year, makes the opening day roster and comes out of the season gangbusters. Colton Cowser has been in the midst of a very difficult stretch right now. He's hitting just 160 over the last 32 games. And the only downside I think you could say of Heston Kjerstad being called back up is maybe he's cannibalizing Colton Cowser's opportunities. Maybe he's getting the opportunities that Colton Cowser would be getting if he were not struggling as mightily as he is. I don't think I'm all that concerned about Cowser this season because he is still continuing to hit the ball well. His defense is so much more improved over last year that he is going to be a positive WAR player, even if he's not hitting that well. But now you're starting to see a little bit of Heston Kjerstad eating into the opportunities that would be going to Colton Cowser.
Yeah, it's hard for him to take all of Cowser's opportunities because the defense is so different between the two. And Cowser is still the backup center fielder on this team. And I guess you would say probably Mateo would go out there if like Mullins and Cowser ever got hurt in a game. I don't think Austin Hayes is going to play out there much more. And obviously that is not Heston Kjerstad's position. Cowser's been, behind Steven Kwan, the best left fielder in terms of outs above average in baseball this year. And something really surprising is he's been okay in center, okay in right. If you look at, I believe it's defensive run value, which is kind of StatCast's version of defensive run saved, Cowser has been the 4th best defensive player in all of Major League Baseball this year. That is how good he's been. His arm strength is rated top 5 in all of baseball. He is great out there. So that's what he can bring that Heston Kjerstad cannot in the outfield. And the other thing about Cowser is that he needs to be studied by baseball historians for what has gone on this season so far. Incredible April, Really not much production in May and June, but the underlying stats have almost gotten better in that time. He's hitting the ball harder. He's barreling the ball more. This is not like, oh, he looks good. Like statistically, he is barreling the ball more often than any other Oriole. That includes Gunnar Henderson. Gunnar is the only guy hitting the ball harder than Colton Cowser so far this year, but he can't hit a non-fastball. And so if you are a pitcher and if you are throwing Colton Cowser a fastball, you should probably be sent back down to AAA, because if you just read a scouting report, you know how to attack him right now. So it's a weird spot for the O's where maybe Kjerstad can allow Cowser to sit in the cage and just see slider, curveball, changeup, and just figure out how to hit it. He will adjust. But the flip side is you are losing a lot on defense if you have Kjerstad out there instead of Cowser, which is why I think Kjerstad will play more than he did his first stint this year when he was basically a pinch hitter. But I don't even think they're going to platoon them. I just think they're going to throw out one guy for a couple days, the other guy for a couple days, and the other one will be a pinch hitter or a defensive replacement in Cowser's stance. And it's a weird way to do it because you can't really let anyone get regular at-bats. But this is the state of the Orioles system. They have too much talent for everybody to play every day. So guys just got to buy into a role that's not super regular. And some guys thrive in that role. We saw Ryan O'Hearn do it. We kind of saw Kyle Stowers do it earlier this year. Some guys really struggle in that role. I'm interested to see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you bring up Stowers because he was sent down when the Orioles called up Nick Maton when Jordan Westburg they thought might have to hit the IL. So they said, let's get an infielder in here just in case. Bring up Nick Maton. Westburg ended up avoiding the IL. But as a result, Stowers had to be sent back down, and the Orioles couldn't bring him back up that quickly. I liked the idea of having Stowers on this roster instead of Kjerstad only because you knew that he was not going to play as frequently. And he is not as highly rated a prospect. The Orioles don't have as much invested in Kyle Stowers. He was doing well with the opportunities that he was being given. 286 average. He was starting to carve out a nice little bench role. Kjerstad makes it a little bit more complex because you want to give him opportunities because he's a top 100 prospect. He's one of the best prospects in all of baseball. Stowers was nicely fitting into a bench role. For Kjerstad, you feel like you want to play him a little bit more. And I still want to see more from Kyle Stowers, whether he's traded in a month or not. I still would like to see him get more opportunities in the big leagues just because I think every time he's been given a chance and he's been healthy enough, he has done well with those chances.
Yeah, and you're also in a weird spot because all the veterans are starting to play well again. Santander has been, a top 5 hitter in baseball, full stop, in the month of June. Most home runs ever for him in 1 month in his career. Cedric Mullins is still not 2021 Cedric Mullins, and I don't think he ever will be, but he had a 10-game hitting streak that was snapped last night. He's swinging the bat much better. Austin Hayes is certainly not in any kind of everyday role, but as a platoon bat right now, he's been really good since coming off the IL with that calf injury in mid-May. So things have kind of flipped where for a while early in the season, it was like Mullins and Hayes were unplayable and Santander was good enough, but really wasn't producing. And you were looking at Cowser and Stowers like, hey, these guys might need to carry us. Now it's flipped. Cowser is struggling. Stowers had to go to AAA, and you are back to the side of the veterans. And that's where I think this ends up being a good thing for the Orioles, because we've never gotten to the point where all the outfielders are struggling. It's either been the young guys playing well, or now it's the veterans playing well. And at some point, the young guys are going to need to step up again. And it's nice that the Orioles have 3 options in Cowser, in Kjerstad, and in Stowers to go to. Now, if one of those guys could go this offseason and just turn himself into a right-handed hitter, a lot of the Orioles' problems would be solved. Unfortunately, that's not very easy to do, especially in your mid-20s. So we're at this point where you're in a weird spot. You can't really platoon guys. Jorge Mateo as an outfielder didn't really work out like you wanted to. Ryan McKenna is gone. Austin Hayes isn't playing every day. It is going to be a weird situation, but these things tend to work themselves out. So far, they've worked themselves out with some injuries like to Hayes and with some guys just not performing. And I think that will continue where Stowers will get a fair share, Kjerstad will get a fair share, Cowser will get a fair share. And by September, I think we'll at least know, okay, who deserves to be on this playoff roster and who doesn't. That's why it's nice that it's June. You got a lot of time to figure this out. And if 1 or 2 of them end up in AAA, that's amazing depth to have because somebody is bound to get injured at some point.
Yeah, and they might this logjam might be loosened a little bit because of trades in about a month, and we'll touch on that in just a little bit. But we were talking about before the season, how is the pitching staff going to sort itself out? Because you had seemingly all of these starters for not enough roles. That has worked itself out, but in a way that the Orioles would probably not prefer because of the number of injuries that they've sustained. Already lost 3 starters to elbow surgery. That is the bigger concern existentially during this month of June, because Brandon Hyde, it feels like the dark days of the Orioles rebuild, Connor, where you couldn't go through a Brandon Hyde press conference without him talking about and pleading publicly for length and depth from his starting pitchers. That was really all he asked, was just don't implode. Please don't go out there and get shelled and I have to pull you in the second inning. And if you could just get to the 4th, 5th, 6th innings, that'll be enough. That's how it felt a little bit with Cade Povich last night, who, by the way, has been thrown into, the hottest of infernos in his first 4 starts in the big league, starting at Toronto, Atlanta, and then starting against the Yankees in the Bronx, and then last night going up against the Guardians, one of the better teams in all of baseball. And he has been able to shake off and push through long 30-plus pitch first innings and give them 4 2/3 against the Yankees, give them 5 2/3 last night, more than you can reasonably expect from a rookie pitcher. But we're starting to see the Albert Suarez experiment start to, he's starting to regress back towards the mean. He's starting to turn back, unfortunately, into a pumpkin like we expected, which is not to diminish anything that he's done so far. But this was never the plan to have Albert Suarez, 34 years old, start this many games. And Dean Kramer had a less than ideal, as Brandon Hyde said, rehab start in Norfolk, where he couldn't get out of the first inning. And he's going to have to make another rehab start before he comes back, which is not what they wanted to do. This is the bigger threat to the Orioles at least before the All-Star break, before they can just remap everything out, is just how are you going to get through the next 2 weeks with the starting pitchers that you have right now? Are your starters going to give you nearly enough depth to be able to get to the bullpen and work things out and patch together games?
I think it's nice to have Corbin Burnes and Grayson Rodriguez still. And although Grayson wasn't at his best and Burnes gave up 4 runs for the first time, he still gave you 7 innings in that game over the weekend, which was nice. You can count on those two. I will say, I've been talking about it over the last week or so after these last 2 starts. I do think whenever Dean Kramer does come back, I think it's going to be Albert Suarez who goes to the bullpen and Cade Povich keeps his rotation spot, and then someone like Nick Vespi probably just gets optioned back down to AAA. I think Povich has done enough to hold that spot for now. That could certainly change as the season goes on. But the weird thing about Kramer is, it was not good, right? 5 runs, 2/3 of an inning in his last rehab start. You don't want to take too much from a line in AAA when you're on rehab. We saw it from John Means. He got shelled in a couple rehab starts, and then he came back in his first start against Cincinnati. It was one of the best games he had ever pitched in his life. So you don't want to take too much from that. But the issue with Kramer coming back is, he's a guy who can eat innings, and he's been a big part of this rotation for 3 years. But Dean Kramer is really your number 5 starter when it's all said and done. And so, yes, it's nice to get Dean Kramer back. But even when he comes back, you're just replacing Albert Suarez with Dean Kramer as your number 5 starter. What you need is somebody a little better to come back healthy. And that's not going to happen because Means and Wells and Bradish are done for the year. So I think the O's can get to the All-Star break. They may have to call on Julio Teheran at some point here soon, who they brought back on a minor league deal, the veteran who's now pitching and starting in AAA Norfolk. I mean, this is a crazy thing to say, but it's kind of unfortunate that Bruce Zimmerman is injured right now. Is he that good? I don't know. But at the very least, he has pitched major league innings for you as a starter over the last 5 seasons. So it would be nice if he was at least healthy in Norfolk, which he is not. And because of that, you're looking down there and you're like, okay, we call up Julio Teheran and he doesn't pitch well. And let me tell you, he hasn't been great in either AAA or the bigs this year with other organizations. Your next option is Chase McDermott. And I don't know if the O's want to go that direction just yet, but they may have to. So I think you're right about you just need to get to the All-Star break. I think Julio Teheran makes a start before the All-Star break just to help this Orioles team get there. And then you can take those 4 days off. You can kind of reset yourself and you can really evaluate, okay, what do we need? Who do we have? Who is actually healthy? And resetting things, I think, is going to be really, really nice for this Orioles team.
how tempted do you think Mike Elias is looking out to St. Louis, looking at a guy with a massive appetite, a guy who is just starving for innings every day, no matter how many you give him? 86 innings so far for Kyle Gibson. He's got a 3.44 ERA, the old innings eater. How much do you think Mike Elias would love to just... I'm not saying the Orioles are going to go out and trade for an innings eater at the deadline, but God, I'll bet Elias is just wishing he had somebody like a Lyles or like a Gibson to just chomp down on innings.
Yeah, and you kind of have it with Corbin Burns. It's just that he's also a Cy Young candidate, so he doesn't really fit the same
Yeah.
mold. But yeah, it would be nice. And I advocated a lot in the offseason for bringing Kyle Gibson back because I was like, you never know what's going to happen with pitching injuries. And here we are. Now, it seemed like a lot of Gibson going to St. Louis was kind of finishing his career back at home, where he is from, and also giving him a chance to pitch for a solid team. And they're in the playoff race at this point, and I'm not sure they're going to sell. Kind of time will tell with the Cardinals. But it would be so nice if even you had Kyle Gibson with a 4.4 ERA right now, just knowing that every fifth day he would pitch at worst into the sixth inning and probably into the seventh inning every time you gave him the ball. And he might give up 3-4 runs, but you have the offense that more days than not is going to be able to win you a ball game. And that is exactly what happened all year last year with Kyle Bradish. And it would be really nice. It's also a lot of pitching injuries to try and map out before the season that the Orioles have seen already. And it's not just, your triceps, your soreness, your shoulder fatigue. It is your Tommy Johns and your internal braces that are taking guys out until the middle of next year, where you really have to go and look elsewhere. And yeah, I don't think it'll be Kyle Gibson, but they're going to need an arm just to get through the season. They're going to need a veteran arm somewhere just to get through the rest of the year.
Yeah, I mean, I may be underappreciated during their time in Baltimore, both Jordan Lyles and Kyle Gibson, just because the quality of innings was never incredible.
And they stayed healthy too.
They stayed healthy. They were great clubhouse guys. They were veterans. They were eating innings on teams that very much needed it. And I thought, all right, the Orioles have moved past that point where they need those kind of guys. But I did not foresee 3 season-ending elbow surgeries for 3 Orioles starters at this point in the season. So if you could just get anybody, the biggest concern I said last week on a show with Danielle Allentuck is it's June 25th. I mean, you're concerned about other guys going down before the end of the season. Knock on wood, you hope it doesn't happen, but you got to have a plan B, a plan C, and a plan D just in case. And to get to the end of the season with your starting rotation healthy would be a minor miracle. At this point, as you look ahead to the trade deadline, Connor, if you could build in a lab your ideal trade candidate for the Orioles while still being realistic, assuming you're not going to go out and be able to get whoever your top guy is on your board, who would you look for? What kind of qualities would you look for in a trade candidate for the Orioles at the deadline?
Yeah, if we're talking about starting pitchers, I'm first looking for somebody with some track record of health. That doesn't predict future health, but previous health is a better predictor than previous lack of health. And so I would look at that first. I would look at somebody who can miss some bats, which I think will be nice for the Orioles to have, because near the end of their rotation, they're kind of throwing guys out there who aren't really piling up the strikeouts. And honestly, I'm not super worried about price, but what I'm also probably looking for is someone with at least 1.5 years of team control. Yes. Because if you look at what the Orioles are going to lose into next year, they won't have John Means. He was going to be a free agent anyway, but he'll be injured. They won't have Tyler Wells. They won't have Kyle Bradish. You would think at least for the first half of next season. I don't think Albert Suarez will be back with this team. And you're kind of looking around and you're saying, what do we have here? You would like to go get somebody like that. But if you can't and you can only get a rental, that's okay, because again, you have Corbin Burns for 1 year. You're kind of trying to win the World Series this season. The guy that I have been pinpointing name-wise and I think has some track record of health, has been good this year. Now, he is a rental, but he's been pitching better and better, and he's been missing more and more bats, is Luis Severino. If the Mets decide to deal, now they have gone on a little Grimace-aided winning streak, and hopefully that continues these next couple of days because they play the Yankees this week in the Subway Series. But even if the Mets are like quasi in it, there are about 10 National League teams that are kind of in it in the wild card. I think David Stearns, who is now in charge of baseball operations over there, would be willing to trade away their rental players and still try and quote unquote kind of half in, half out and play for next year when they try to probably sign Juan Soto and, put together an even better baseball team. And Severino, who is a rental and is pitching well and had 10 Ks and was awesome on Sunday Night Baseball in his last start. He's pitched in the AL East. He wasn't good the last couple years, which is why he went to free agency after his time with the Yankees ended pretty abruptly. But he was good for a while, and then he just got his power zapped by the Monstars last year, and that made him get a 1-year, $10 million deal. I think the Orioles have the pitching lab to figure out what went wrong. He's already kind of figured it out a little bit. And that's kind of the mold I'm looking for. A Luis Severino with 1.5 years of control would basically be my perfect solution right now for the Orioles rotation. Unfortunately, he is on an expiring contract.
Yeah, I mean, if you had an extra year though of him, I like him as a rental because there's still not a guarantee you're able to figure things out. I thought the Orioles might be able to get more out of Jack Flaherty last year than they were able to. And if Luis Severino, you trade for him, I just don't know if you can rely on him to be in your playoff rotation. And that's what I think you need to be looking for is more than just the team control. I think you got to get somebody who can start game 3 of a playoff series, because who else would it be? We've seen how Dean Kramer starting a playoff game can go. I know he's been better this year, but you want to have somebody a little bit better than that, an upgrade there. Luis Severino would be intriguing. I mentioned him a couple weeks ago on the podcast. I also thought he might have made sense as a free agent, but he ended up signing for way more than I thought he would, because teams saw his previous track record and thought that they could get something out of him, obviously. I also think it's going to be interesting if we're going to see a Masson trade, because the Nats have a couple pitchers that have been overperforming. Trevor Williams, I think he might still be hurt, but how many times have we seen trades between the Orioles and Nats? It doesn't tend to happen that often.
I don't think much. I am trying to remember even one. I mean, there's been some players exchanged, but they've been a lot of waiver claims, the Hunter Harveys of the world. There's been guys who've Austin Voth. There's been guys who have kind of left one team and gone directly to the other, maybe in free agency after getting released. We saw Matt Wieters do it. I'm about to name some guys. Steve Lombardozzi did it back in the day. But
thank you for warning and saying I'm about to name some guys.
Matt Albers. But there hasn't been a lot of direct trades between the two teams, but it would make a lot of sense because not only do they have a couple of starters who could be intriguing, and we'll see if Trevor Williams comes back health-wise, and he might be also a little bit of waving, a hand in front of your face to not pay attention to what's going on underneath the hood for his numbers. But they have a lot of good bullpen pieces as well, which is weird to say about the Washington Nationals. But shout out to Sean Doolittle, who has joined their coaching staff and has basically fixed whatever goes on in their pitching development. And they've churned out a lot of relievers who they could be dealing away, or they could say, hey, we're only 2 games out of the wild card because the National League is a mess and we're not going to trade anyone. That's the big thing here, Paul, why I said Luis Severino, is because there are so many teams who are still in it. And I even think a month from now, when we're right up on the trade deadline, especially in that National League wild card, there's going to be so many teams who are still in it, where there might be some who do kind of the add and subtract at the same time thing and might trade away their rentals. But if you are trying to get a really good starting pitcher who will be in your top 3, who will start a playoff game, and maybe has more than just this half year of control, those players are on a lot of teams who are still in it. And I just don't think a lot of teams are going to be willing to trade a lot of these guys with their fan bases looking on and saying, we are a game and a half out of the wild card. Why are you trading away our ace over to the Orioles? And on the flip side, if those teams are willing to trade, they're going to say, hey, we're 2 games out. Our asking price is going to be way higher than it would be if we were 10 games out, because we're fine if we still keep the guy. We'll try and make the playoffs. So that asking price is going to go up. The Orioles aren't going to want to give up the prospect capital that it takes to get those guys. And I've heard a lot of baseball analysts talk about this already over the last few weeks. This could be one of the biggest dud trade deadlines, maybe the trade deadline this year, that we have seen in a long time, because there are too many teams in it, and there are not a lot of high-value rentals out there that could be still traded. Right. And so we're at the point where Luis Severino might be one of the best pitchers the Orioles can reasonably get without giving up a Kobe Mayo or a Samuel Basayo to go get him. I think people really want that top-level pitcher, and that's fine. I want him too. I'm trying to purvey that I don't think he's going to be out there unless you want to literally ship off the entire farm to get him.
Speaking of which, I want to get your thoughts on the possibility of trading Samuel Basallo, because I think there are a lot of guys that the Orioles consider not untouchable, but would take getting back an ace level player, a superstar level player. I think on that list is Jackson Holliday. I think Heston Kjerstad and Kobe Mayo are probably on that list as well. I think the Orioles would be very reticent to trade them. The only one who's considered a top 100 prospect, a consensus top 100 prospect, who doesn't quite fit into their short-term plans is Samuel Basallo, because they have James McCann under contract through the end of the year. Basallo's only 19. He's got a 786 OPS in Double-A right now, and it's his defense that is the one part of his game that is lagging behind currently. Is he going to get the opportunities as a backup catcher for the Orioles in 2025? Is he going to be ready for the big leagues in 2025? Would it be underutilizing his talent just to have him as a backup catcher and competing for DH opportunities with Adley and with Ryan O'Hearn and whoever else? So Basallo is the only guy that I could see the Orioles actually dealing who's considered an elite level prospect. Would you still be afraid to trade him just because of the potential there and the idea that he could be a serviceable backup in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it obviously depends on what you think you can get for Samuel Basallo. Right. I don't think he's even getting to the bigs until 2026. So I think he's a little ways out if you still want him to be a catcher. Now, if you just say, hey, we have Adley Rutschman, we're going to bring in veteran backups for him, give up on catching, you're going to be a first base DH, he could be in the big leagues next year with the bat. Right. But I think value-wise, they're going to want him to be able to catch. For at the very least, if you maybe at one point, carry 3 catchers, with Samuel Basallo being one of them, and he plays a lot of other places, but that can catch for you once a week, that's super valuable. Or if he is your backup catcher, but he's also playing a lot of first base and DH, that's also super valuable because you're not taking up a spot with James McCann, who is a great veteran to have in the clubhouse and a great defensive catcher, but he doesn't really give you much when you have to play him at the plate. If you have Basallo as a backup catcher who's playing elsewhere, that's amazing. But if the Orioles want him to develop as a big league level catcher, he's not going to be in the big leagues until 2026. So it's really about how much do you weigh that future versus wanting to win the World Series this year or potentially next year. I just think with Basallo, with him being 19 years old, with his stock still potentially rising, I can't imagine a spot where the Orioles trade him this deadline. And I think if you're trading a guy like Basallo, it's probably in the offseason when you can better evaluate exactly what you're getting. Some of these deadline trades are a little hurried at times. You don't know exactly what version of a player you're getting. But if you can get someone in the offseason, you can work with them through spring training. You can work with them through the winter. You know exactly how much service time you're going to have with them. You have a much more time to put a plan in place for that player. And I think in the offseason, you're more willing to make those kind of deals. That's why the O's were willing to part with DL Hall and Joey Ortiz in the offseason to go get someone like Corbin Burnes. So I don't see him being dealt at this deadline, but in terms of my personal opinion, if you could go get another Corbin Burnes type pitcher, I would give up Samuel Basallo because A, you have Adley Rutschman, and B, if you can get that guy to have a 3-headed monster rotation heading into the postseason, this team becomes one of, if not the World Series favorite, if you can get another ace-type starting pitcher. And I would give up pretty much anyone not named Jackson Holliday to go get another ace for this rotation. I just think that guy's not going to be out there, and that's why I think he won't be traded, but I would do it if that deal came along.
Yeah, it would have to be for a guy that checks literally every box, that is an ace-level pitcher that, is under team control through at least 2025. I don't think you can trade Basallo for a rental.
If the Tigers made Tarek Skubal available,
I was literally about to mention him. Yeah,
that is who I would throw in Basallo for a deal.
Right, Skubal's not going to be a free agent until 2027, so that is going to take an absolute haul to get him out of there, and that's even if they entertain trading him. But somebody of that ilk, somebody that you just need to have in your building and say he will change our rotation for 2025 and 2026 plus this playoff run. But until that guy becomes available, it's just very, very difficult to give up on a talent like Basayo. But the Orioles are going to have to make their decisions at some point soon because trade deadline is around the corner. I hope it does not end up being a trade deadline, as you said, Connor, because I think fortunes might change for teams over the coming month. We don't know what's going to happen with the Mets. We don't know what's going to happen with all these National League wildcard quote unquote contenders. Which of them are going to become pretenders? Some of these GMs need to just embody Mike Elias's spirit at the 2022 deadline and understand that they probably won't be long-term contenders, that maybe they should deal some guys away, focus on the future. But they have a month to figure that out. Connor, at Connor Newcomb on Twitter, and Locked On Orioles. You podcast Monday through Friday. I don't know how you do that along with living your life and playing softball with us every Monday night too.
Yeah, I mean, so it's really softball, number one.
Sure,
living my life, number two, and then Locked On Orioles podcast, number three. Obviously, softball is clearly number one. I haven't won a Volo championship yet. It has to happen now.
Yeah.
We went. People, I guess, have to know this. We went winless in the spring season. We're already 2-0 in the summer season, so that has moved up to number one.
We got matched with the right guys this year. I mean, I was not at last night's game, but I heard we knocked off the team that won the championship last year.
We did. 11-10 victory, huge. Paul. Yeah.
How'd you do at the plate?
I don't want to talk about
it. Connor, you have an incredible knack of going the other way. That's what I'll say. Is you have a kind of an inside out swing, but you just drop balls into right field. It's very impressive. If the Orioles, can learn anything from you, it's to hit the ball the other way.
Yeah, people have been calling me a modern day Luis Ariz. I haven't been saying it, but people have been saying
it. The word is out there at least. You can catch Connor Newcomb on the Locked On Orioles podcast, and his face is popping up everywhere around Twitter and Orioles Twitter, and at the ballpark. We see him quite often down at Oriole Park at Camden Yards. I'm Paul Mancano. Thanks so much to Connor for joining me on this week's show. And of course, like, rate, review, subscribe. Give us a good review. I'll read it out here on the show. Share the Banner Baseball Show with your friends and subscribe to the Baltimore Banner. $1 for 6 months. Thanks so much for tuning in. We'll catch you